more informal of a conversation. Is that okay?
Sure.
All right, excellent.
Before you start, I just a housekeeping thing. I didn't get any email reminders, so I went on the Facebook page and it said the registration was closed, but I copied and pasted the Zoom address anyway because I wanted to join, just to let you know that if other people, you know, let that stop them, there might be fewer people than want to be on.
Yeah.
So you did not get a reminder?
No, I went back all the way to early August and I didn't get any reminder emails. But that didn't stop me. I went online, I found the Facebook page, I clicked on the link, but it said the registration for this event was closed, but I didn't care to be stopped by that. So I copied and pasted the Zoom link anyway, and here I am.
Well, I appreciate you giving us that feedback, because we did have, so do me a favor, Dr. Lynn, and just check your spam folder for me. We did send out reminders for the calls on Sunday, or Monday. I think it was Monday, actually, yesterday. So I want to make sure that there wasn't some snafu with the system there. So we'll look into that. And in the meantime, we're going to go ahead and make the best use of yours and Jonathan and Melissa's time. Melissa, how are you? Are you able to hear us okay?
She just clicked off.
She totally did.
I'm not sure what happened, but she was on there.
All right. Well, hopefully Melissa will be back, but let's go ahead and dive right into this. So welcome, Dr. Lynn and Jonathan, and anybody else who chooses to review the recording afterwards or join us today. I'm really glad all of you can be here. This is an ISODC Roundtable, and our particular topic today is culture, looking specifically at how culture impacts you and your work, and better understanding those impacts, and further exploring questions around culture that are going to help you become more effective in your endeavors. And so we only have 2 participants today, which is absolutely awesome. We really set up the ISODC roundtables to be very open space-like, and the idea that whoever comes are the right people to that conversation. Whenever the conversation starts, it starts, and when it ends, it ends. And the topics that we're discussing are the right topics. And so our guide today is around culture. Our agenda specifically, and we're going to kind of follow along with it, but in a very informal way. I did paste that into the chat, and so if you're not seeing that, let me know. But our agenda really is geared to getting a primer about culture from Jerry Glover. Roland is not able to join us today unexpectedly. And then we wanted to have a couple conversations really focused on what culture means to you as a change leader and in your work, and also have a discussion on deeper diving into those topics that we want to dive into around culture. I will say this morning's conversation, we really kept it very informal as well, and gave people the opportunity to kind of dive in around some of the questions around culture and how it's affecting their work. Dr. Lynn, something tells me that you and Jonathan will definitely drive us to have the conversations that we need to have. And so we're really excited that you're joining us today. And without further ado, what I want to do is kind of turn it over to you, Mr. Jerry Glover, and have you talk about, I would say maybe using your slides, but going through your presentation and what you wanted to talk about in a more informal way than an actual presentation. And then we'll kind of open it up for discussion there as well. And as Dr. Myers joins us.
Hello.
Yep, he's here.
Started with our presentation from Jerry. So Jerry, I'll turn it over to you so that you can take us through the primer.
Okay. And once again, Roland sends his regrets, and he he will be around soon, but he had to do a little medical procedure today, so he's out for the day. And I just have, to start off, I have a couple, well, actually 67 slides that I wanted to go through with you. It won't take too long. Sorry, it's late in the afternoon. I thought
that was cute.
Yeah. Okay. And I saw Jeremy panic. So at any rate, I just want to make one mention about culture, and everyone here, I'm sure, knows has an idea in their own mind of what it is. And I think it's important to remember that basically, if you look at it in a culturally relative and a global way, culture is really what the knowledge that human groups use to interact with one another, to adapt to their environments, to organize in various ways to do different things. And those organizations have technology, strategy, systems, structures, and processes. But one of the points I wanted to make, and the reason I brought this slide out, is that basically technology, strategy, systems, structures, and processes are part of culture, and they're influenced and defined by culture. And culture is not a side dish besides those five areas. It's actually the main course, and it's what influences those areas. And then in turn, organizations come out with organizational outcomes in a particular cultural context. And I think it's important to make that distinction, because too often I've heard people refer to culture as one of those many things that organizations have. Culture is basically what the organization is in terms of the knowledge about how to do things, how to interact with one another, how to use technology, how to do financial systems, and so on and so forth. And I make that point first. Secondly, some of the questions that Roland and I talked about that we might want to look at is why is culture so important to change and development? What are the costs of not being culturally competent? How are change and development models the results of cultural designs? In other words, ideas in the minds of people about what the world would be like if this innovation or this new development model is put in place. Along with that, how do we fit a particular change and development initiative to the cultural context of the people in the organization involved? And finally, what is important for change leaders to realize about their own bias going into change and development initiatives? And one of the pet peeves I have, and the people in ISODC particularly are tired of having me say it, but organizational development, organizational change initiatives, organizational leaders have their own cultural values about the way to go about things. One of the best articles I ever read, too, was by Bob Marshak back in the 90s, where he compared both Chinese and Western models of change. We actually go through the processes of change on the basis of culture. So I can't think of a more important subject for organizational development and change people to be looking at besides culture. And I probably say that, too, because I'm a cultural anthropologist by training and have worked with these issues for a long time and realize the importance of it. Okay. So with that in mind, let me go back. All right. And also say that what we want to do here is to give people an opportunity to discuss the importance of culture to your professional development and to what you're actually doing as a professional. And I happen to be very biased, as I just stated, in that I don't think OD programs and management programs, business schools teach enough about culture. And when they do teach it, I don't think they really have a very good handle on it many times. I once read a book in graduate school in anthropology by Kroeber, and it had in it 1,050 different definitions of culture. And I don't know why they made me read it, but I did read it, and I wouldn't make anyone else do it. But it was interesting to me because it did teach me one thing. The culture of the people who study culture is quite different many times. And if we go and we look at how, for example, a psychologist might view culture, it might be quite different from how a cultural anthropologist would view it. Or if we look at how a person from management or business might look at it. So these professional differences are important to consider as well. Okay. So, given that, I think the important thing is to have a dialogue now about, but how does it affect you, and how do you see it influencing you, and how do we look at organizations from the standpoint and the perspective and the lens, as Roland said this morning, of culture. Everyone has their own lens that they look at things through, and being able to understand and to realize how we're seeing an organization or a group or a country or an ethnic group or whatever through a cultural lens is very important. And Roland also mentioned the work of Edgar Schein this morning. And Edgar Schein, as most of you all know, has done quite a bit of work with culture and is a well-known authority on it. And he has done a lot of work in terms of helping people understand the differences between functional areas in an organization, between executives and accountants and so forth. And that's a very important distinction, is to realize that most organizational cultures have more variation within them than between them. And I can say that from the fact that I did studies of organizational culture, 33 of them, in fact, over about a 10-year period around the world. And one of the surprising results we got is that the variation by level in the organization, by functional areas in the organization, and by regions in the organizations was many times greater than the variation between organizations. And so it struck me as something that was important, but something we very rarely hear people talking about. So when you talk about an organization having this kind of culture or that kind of culture, I often, in my own mind, question that based on the results of all the research we did. And we had a database of just about 30,000 people from 33 different companies or organizations, rather. Anything from military organizations to hospitals to businesses to school systems and so forth. So we had a pretty good sample of what organizational culture was, and we learned a lot from doing it. So at any rate, given that, I'll turn it back over to, I guess, Jeremy, you want it next, or should we go to each individual? Jeremy?
So, yep, I'm here. My apologies.
Okay.
I didn't realize you were coming back that quickly, so sorry about that.
I thought you wanted me to. Sorry, I can talk longer. I've been.
No. You're absolutely fine, Jerry. It's fine. It's absolutely fine. So, like I said, folks, our goal was to really kind of dive a little bit further into this, expecting, we had, I think, 9 to 12 people registered for this call, and this morning we did have more. And so I want to make sure that we're best using your guys' time, looking at what we were really going to try to talk about in the first section. I think we should actually still go through that and give you guys an opportunity to answer the questions that were part of what we would have done as a breakout activity. And I think what that's going to be able to do is to just give us a good place to start the conversation and to see where we go from here. Because we can really take this in any direction that, the three of you would like to go. And so as we're kind of looking at this, we have 2 questions that we're looking at. The first one is, who am I and what do I do? The second one is really looking at the question, what does culture mean to me as a change leader and in my work? And so what I'd like to do is just to give you guys each an opportunity to go through those questions so that we can give you a chance to weigh in. So why don't we start, if it's okay, with Dr. Lynn, if you don't mind, Dr. Lynn. And I did put those 2 questions in the chat box for you. But again, it's who am I and what do I do? And what does culture mean to me as a change leader and in my work?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'd love to go next. First of all, thank you for the open space references, reminding me of many happy memories with Harris and Owen in many, many, many open space meetings and conferences over the years. And also Ed Schein was one of the people that supported me when I was pioneering the work on positive change many years ago. I studied with him at MIT as part of my doctoral work. And so all of these things are, you know, like old homework. Old home week for me is wonderful. And I just had an insight that I've never had before, that I'd never put together, which is very cool. And that is, it was a paper that I did on organizational culture at the beginning of my MBA program at the University of Chicago, after I did my econ degree there and had staff and line management experience. I went back for my MBA. And it was that paper on organizational culture which caused a professor to call me in and have a long conversation with me about what I was interested in. And having seen a people unfriendly organization from which I had resigned to do my MBA, I was very keen on culture, but I didn't realize exactly what culture was in the way that I do now. And she called me in and we had many, many long conversations. And in that program, I discovered OD and change and team building and group dynamics and all of that. And I fell head over heels in love. I went from the quietest person to the most talkative person in class by sociometric ratings in 11 weeks. We had 3 full quarters at Chicago, not 2 semesters. So, I mean, I just never put that together. This is very cool. So culture, the focus on an organizational culture, is what drew me into OD in the first place. And then, and also I have to say, I was raised multilingually, multinationally, multiculturally. So I grew up around lots of different cultures and I was used to that as normal. And that illuminates all my work and was a perfect preparation for all my work in organizational transformation. I left the field of OD behind while I was still in graduate school when I got the intuitive download. Some of you have heard this before, forgive the repetition, but some people don't know it, about how all change and leadership should be based on appreciating the best, seeing and appreciating the best in each other instead of focusing on what's wrong and tripping over our problems. So I pioneered that work. I have the first PhD in it. And I have to say, as a result of that, culture is crucially important for me in all of the work that I do, because what I'm doing is I'm helping them, by definition, shift from a more problem-focused to more strengths-based culture. And of course, some of you know I have a whole fleet of engine and four-wheel systems for almost every aspect of leadership in order to have that affect the bottom line and the multiple bottom lines, in fact. So culture is central to me. When I go into an organization, I have a list of anywhere between 8 and 12 factors that I consider in my change work to understand their culture. And I consider it very important. And Jerry, your comment about more differences within an organization and cultures than between organizations, I also find fascinating. I have found more differences in culture between the various functions and disciplines in organizations than I have across organizations. So I thought that was a very telling and insightful comment. So just that's my opening statement. I'm open to questions, feedback, comments.
So let's go ahead and what I actually want to do is I want to give the other 2 people on the call an opportunity to weigh in. So Tom or Jonathan, let's give you guys an opportunity to kind of just introduce yourself into the conversation. Who are you and what do you do? And what does culture mean to you as a change leader and in your work? So Jonathan, maybe we have you go next. Jonathan, remember you got to take yourself off of mute.
Yeah, I just did.
There you go.
Well, let's see. I mean, there's so many things I could say. Right now I'm sitting where I live, which is in Cape Town, South Africa. South Africa has 11 official languages, much going on in the sense of larger culture, and they're struggling to find ways of working and living together. So some of the definitions of culture that I've used in my work came more out of the cross-cultural sort of Hofstede sort of stuff about, well, there were just lots of definitions, and I tended to use 2 or 3 when I was working in that area, and then would let the group choose whatever definition it was that appealed to them the most. That was kind of fun. But the short form definition that seems to work for me is something about the way we do things around here.
That's great.
That's kind of a definition for an organizational context. Anyway, yeah, about the differences, but within organizations. I used to work for an outfit that had a bunch of salespeople and had a bunch of boy, they were from radically different cultures, the 2 of them. And so the sales guys would go out and promise customers impossible things and then bring back those promises to the engineers and say, well, you've got to make this work or I'm not going to get my bonus. And so, yeah, there were great differences in the cultures that were quite evident in that organization. Gee, I don't know. There's lots of things I could say, but at the moment, that's about it for an introduction. I'm here in South Africa. I am not legally permitted to work, so I do some work for some folks and get paid in the United States for some things, but other things I'm doing more on a sort of a volunteer basis, and there are lots of opportunities here to get involved where people need a little bit more of a professional approach to what they're doing inside of organizations. There's not the luxury graduate degrees in all levels of society here, so there's lots of potential stuff to do. And I think culture is probably the most important leverage point because you've got to sort of start making explicit the unspoken assumptions that underlie the culture in organizations. You've got to bring them out in a spirit of inquiry and examine them fairly carefully and look for places where people's personal values and their work values, where the organization's values overlap so that you can get people aligned and excited about pursuing whatever it is they're working together on.
Jonathan, what a great introduction. Thank you so much. And we're so glad you're joining us from Africa. We can truly say this was an international gathering now. So thank you for that. Let's go over to Dr. Tom. Tom, how are you doing today? Let's go ahead and have you weigh in. Who are you and what do you do? And what is culture to you as a change leader and in your work?
What I mostly try and do is organization development and design. Over the decades, I've done a lot of training. And in fact, started out in that area more than anything else as an Army officer. I've also taught organization development. And I guess Jerry's statement is correct that the OD books that I taught from did not hit on culture certainly as much as Jerry has. There were a whole lot of other aspects, and the OD courses were essentially kind of like anthologies, and so they covered all of the different aspects of organization development and, to a certain amount, organization design. I excuse me, use organization design in my work because that's a physical manifestation of what the culture is, should be, or wants to be. And so, you've got the old Lewin idea of unfreezing, change, and refreeze. And what is being unfrozen is the design, and what is being refreezed refrozen rather, is the design as well. So I find culture extremely important. If an organization is going to change, it needs to be led through the change, and the leaders of the organization are the people who are supposed to do that. Now, in my work, I try to lead the change process and let the leading of the organization be done by its leaders. However, there are always competing cultural aspects. Some of them are individual. In other words, nobody wants their ox gored, and everybody wants to gain more from the organization than they are currently getting. And so dealing with those leaders and how they think about their values and the way it should be done is extremely important. And essentially, those last two ideas, what should be done, how should we do it, and what are our values? What values am I as a leader going to live out and expect my workers to live out, are key to success.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Really appreciate you weighing in. And Aaron, are you able to hear us, and can we hear you now? Aaron, are you there?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you. Excellent. Aaron, so who are you and what do you do, and what does culture mean to you as a leader, as a change leader, and in your work?
I'm in Canada, from Toronto, background from Hong Kong, and I was a manager at the City of Toronto before. And culture is so important at the national side or from the organization side. So the culture itself, for instance, if you are, well, we talk a lot about changes, but most of the changes, there are so many impediments, hindrance. It's basically because of the values, beliefs, and the way they practice. So it is so important that as OT practitioners, we must be able to change the attitude, change the values, change the way they practice. And that is the way I see it. And it is, my experience of making, for instance, changing the whole organization, moving from to a e-learning situation where the whole organization has been, facing the kind of issues, not taking and accepting, and not easy to accept new technology, not easy to change the practice because of, either belief or the age as well, So these are my experience. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you. We heard you.
Did we lose him?
I think so. And Jeremy, are you there?
It doesn't look like Jeremy's on either. So let's go ahead and go back to you, Jerry. Continue the conversation.
Okay. Yeah, we did hear you, Aaron. And if you're still, are you there at all? No. And Jeremy, how about you? You around, or did you lose connection?
Yes, you should be back. Am I back now?
Yeah, you are.
Yes.
Okay, I'm so sorry about that. So, Aaron, we were able to hear you. I was trying to tell you that, and was basically
I think
wasn't able to do that.
Jeremy, I think we've lost him now.
I should be still there. Are you hearing me now, Jerry?
Not you, Jeremy. I'm talking about Aaron.
Oh, Aaron. Okay, gotcha. Well, we'll go ahead and continue. As I'm listening to this conversation, I'm really thinking about where do we go next in the conversation. I kind of want to turn it back to you, Jerry Glover, and just kind of allow you to maybe give some insights that you were thinking about as you were listening to people's intros. and then we can really even take a step back from that and, you know, ask you guys, Dr. Lynn and Tom, and if we get Aaron back, that will be awesome. We can also kind of check in with you, Jonathan, and figure out where do we want to take the conversation. What are those burning conversations around culture that we can be having that's going to help us transform our work and be more successful with our own endeavors. So be thinking about that. And Jerry, I'm going to come back to you for just a moment and ask if you had any thoughts or insights as you were listening to people in their intros.
Not specific to any of the intros, but I do want to make a comment related to what we've talked about, and that is the issue of culture and can it be measured. I've heard for years the comments that culture is soft and can't be measured, and there's the hard elements of organizations, there's the soft elements, and culture is a soft element. I think that's absolute balderdash. Because culture can be measured. It's a question simply of being able to operationalize it. And one of the things that I've developed over the years is a set of procedures and processes to help to measure culture. And that is by using a framework like the different dimensions involved with culture, individual, collective, achievement, description, and so forth. Those dimensions were developed primarily by Talcott Parsons and Clyde Kluckholm back in the 60s. And then later on, Gert and Vons and others took and packaged them and made them very accessible to people to understand and better use. Having a framework to start with is important. Having that framework be culturally relative is very important. So as to not to bias the measurement system. And one of the reasons why that's important is if you look at motivation in the US, for years motivation was taught as being primarily individually oriented and achievement oriented. And it's certainly not when we go across borders into the global community. So being able to measure change is extremely important, being able to operationalize it so that you can measure it, and being able to use those results in change and development is absolutely critical, because if you're going to change culture, you need to know what it is, and you need to know what you're dealing with, and be able to set up a system that will enable you to measure. And that's one of the reasons I got so involved in measuring organizational cultures at one time, and found that it was extremely helpful and very much a part of the process of understanding change. But I would then turn that back over to everyone in the group and say, might want to know what your experience with assessing culture or working with culture might be, and do you think it's important? Aaron, good to see you back.
So why don't we go ahead and have the other two weigh in on that for me?
Yeah.
Jerry and Jeremy, this is Dr. Lynn. And the facilitator in me has to mention first that I keep seeing Jerry J. John on my screen. He is muted and we haven't heard from him yet. And so I'd like to...
I'm so sorry, Dr. Lynn, you're absolutely right. Jerry J. John is actually working for S&G Endeavors. And so he's kind of working behind the scenes to support us on Zoom. But you're totally right. I should have at least given him the opportunity to say hello. So
once a facilitator, always a facilitator. Can't help myself.
I actually feel a little embarrassed that I missed it. So before we open that back up, Jerry J. John, do you want to take a moment just to kind of introduce yourself and maybe weigh in on those two questions? Who are you and what do you do? And what does culture mean to you and in the work that you're doing as a change leader? Each of us lead change in different ways. So we'll totally put you on the spot with those questions.
Oh, thank you so much. I was not prepared at all. I am an administrative assistant with S&G Endeavors. I work one-on-one with Jeremy a lot. I do all the scheduling of the calls and all that. In my previous life, I worked as a health information manager for a mid-range retirement community. Culturally, working with SNG Endeavors, because we're so small, we're all about the same age. So our culture is not really different, but in my previous experience at the retirement community, as the work generations change and more millennials are feeding into the system, we're actually starting to have classes to know how to work with millennials or work with people from foreign lands, so that we are all working together and we're not necessarily stepping on each other's ways or the way that they do things. And I think that's very interesting. We need to be more observant about who we're working with, and we got to kind of take a step back and look at things from their point of view and kind of find out how we're different and figure out how we can move forward together.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jerry, for weighing in, and thanks, Dr. Lynn, for catching that for me. I love it. So now I'll come back to you guys. Where do we take the conversation? Dr. Lynn, Jonathan, Tom, I'm really focused, and Aaron, you guys are technically what would be considered the participants in this conversation. So I want to kind of leave it up to you guys in the, technically we have half an hour to 45 minutes if you really want them, to talk about anything that you want to talk about with regard to culture. So I don't know if anybody has got an idea of a burning thought or question or conversation that if we talked about it today would really help us take what we're doing to the next level.
I have one. This is Dr. Lynn, and my question is for Dr. Tom. You were talking about organizational design as a manifestation of culture. And I thought that connection was very insightful. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about that.
The organization that a consultant is presented with is a manifestation of the current culture, and is typically the product of it's the combination of the technical systems and the social systems, right? After I took the basic course in organization development from one of the people who did a lot of socio-technical systems redesigns in the 80s, he invited me to join his organization design course, which sort of biased me for life, I think. He gave a lot of weight to culture, but he also tried to describe the different aspects of the structures of organizations. And so that would include the division of labor, coordination, communication, those kinds of things. Reasoning, why will people do what they should do and not do what they shouldn't do, the reward and punishment systems, and finally, authority, who has the authority from the organization to make what decisions about what, when, and under what circumstances. An example of that last thing is that if it comes to a merger, then only the CEO and the board are authorized to do that. But when it comes to pulling the fire alarm, anybody who sees flames outside of someone lighting a cigarette is authorized to pull that alarm. So it was very insightful. This guy was, because of his years of experience, and because he spent actually more of his time on the road working with organizations that were moving towards being socio-technical. So I began to see, based on this instruction, the importance of the structure for producing certain results, and also the kind of, here's what's happening versus here's what's desired. And so in order to get from the former to the latter, there had to be some sort of cultural shift, I guess in 100% of the cases. Otherwise, the organization would already be different at doing what was desired. Does that make sense to everybody? That because it wasn't what they desired, they didn't know how to go from one to the other, and had not done that yet. I had experienced several cultural shifts in my lifetime. I was an Army officer for more than 8 years on active duty, and I knew a whole lot about that. I knew how the Army functioned well beyond my peers, simply because I was interested. And I became a civilian, and it wasn't the same.
My dad was an Army officer. I'm totally with you.
Right. I experienced that again in that I went from a private company to, I was hired by my client, the state of Georgia, as a director of management information systems, what everybody calls IT today. And the state employees had a rather different culture than the go-go IT company that I had come from. And that was really difficult. I did not make that shift 100% perfectly, because I ended up out on the street after a couple of years. And part of that was my inability at that time to understand how they thought and what they wanted. But it was certainly an interesting experience for both the department I worked for and for me. So one of the first things I look for when entering an organization as a consultant is, what is the culture, what's going on? And I use all the usual things that we all do, interviews and surveys if I can find them. I attend the meetings, read papers, that kind of stuff. Okay, so what I find, though, is that in some cases, there are particular biases within organizations, and I don't have any instruments to measure those. One of those, for example, would be the degree of belief in a union. Unionized organizations are at least somewhat different than non-union organizations, in my book. People who are members of the union and were not forced to be by the lack of right to work laws. They're pretty often they're very focused on the value of the union to their work lives. I think a second kind of situation was the military. People on the outside of the military, I think, often don't understand well the culture inside the military, which of course is different depending on where you are in the military. And so if a consultant doesn't truly grasp that well, it's easy to make a lot of mistakes when trying to work with the military. Internally within the military, if you go to the medical corps, which is all physicians, okay, those are the only people in the medical corps, they operate differently. If you go to the Air Force, you will find that there is less of the authoritarian kind of mindset in airplane crews than you would find in ground troops, the infantry and so forth. The there's it's just a different way of thinking and doing. In the Air Force, with no seeming prejudice, the enlisted men called the officers by their first names, and as a ground troop, my experience was that you never ever do that, and what I would never have permitted that as an Army officer.
Right.
So one of the things that I want to ask Jerry is, do you have instruments outside of the main ones that you talked about that Fonz came up with for measuring these more specific kinds of what's the right word? Situations.
Yeah.
Within organizations.
And actually, Jerry, before you dive into that, Aaron has his hand raised, and so I want to just check with Aaron and find out. Aaron, do you want Jerry to answer that question?
Thank you, Jerry. I just want to respond. I think, it's a very interesting points made, because they are really make me feel echoing, because, in terms of, I work in a union environment where it's highly unionized. So the culture really is so much impacting, because management, the culture is so different. And the way we can see and understand the union culture is so important, and understand the way of thinking. And I work with the fire services too, which is very much like the speaker talking about, where it's very much like a military in a way, in a way where we can see that, the way they can understand and accept other things will be very much different. And I want also to make a point too, from the organization culture point of view and on the national culture point of view. When you are working in a country they are really, I work in, places where, countries where they are very much dictatorial, or with sort of not so much democracy. I work in, where I can visit Hong Kong, China, South Africa, and other places, where they are so different. When I work in England, America, and also North America, they are so different. So it links back to the organization design. As an OD practitioner, where we are offering suggestions how organizations should be designed, the way we see learning and how people should learn, so to network, to take order, to take decisions, make decisions, they can be so different. So, really, it is something that will open us up to start looking at, what sort of organization it is, what they value, what they see as the ultimate success, what they see as the ultimate, really of value to them. And then we need to create our own impact, in such a way. So, it seems to be making a lot of meaning. So I'm just, taking the chance to echo back only. Okay? Thank you.
I think, Aaron, so first of all, Aaron, I'm so glad that you weighed in, because that's the kind of dialogue that we definitely want to have. Tom, I may need you to re-ask your question to Jerry, just in case. But I think that's the dialogue that we're really trying to weigh in. And I think that you're also raising some of the challenges, Aaron, as far as, how do you do it and do it well and do it right? Jerry, I'm going to come over, Jerry Glover, to you to answer Tom's question, and then we'll kind of go back to where the conversation takes us next.
I'll make it
brief. Do you need Tom to repeat that question?
No, I don't. I'll make it brief.
Okay.
I mentioned the fact of organizational cultures can be and have been measured effectively. Let me use one example of the 34 organizations that I did studies for the leadership of those organizations, and I actually got paid for every one of them. So it wasn't a research type thing. It was a real project where I was out doing work and providing information back to executives about their organizational cultures. The one that I probably would use as an example, Tom, would be the one with the Australian Air Force that I did. with a group, consulting group in Australia, and we used cultural dilemmas, and we based the unit of analysis in those organizations as social culture encounter. We then identified cultural dilemmas based on what focus groups, interviews, observation, document analysis, all those different techniques. We went out and we gathered 240 different cultural dilemmas. In other words, places where stakeholders in the organization had seemingly opposing different values and views about particular issues or problems. Focusing on the operational problems, so when I say problems, I don't mean that in a negative way, but focusing on the dilemmas where there was potential for conflict or a difference of values and perceptions about how the situation would be handled. We use that as a focus. We identified 242, I still remember, of those so-called dilemmas. We went to Canberra with a project team of people, and we sat down and paired that list of 242 cultural dilemmas, which we had gained through focus groups and interviews and so forth, around the entire Air Force. When we came up with the final list, we had 42. We made that into a survey where we would present the dilemma and then give them a forced choice response to it, which were based on Trompetter's and Hosted's dimensions. In other words, the 10-1 would be a universal response, the 110 would be a particularistic response, and so forth. So we set up a grid and we set up an analysis unit based on those particular dilemmas. We actually administered a survey of those 42 dilemmas to 17,000 people in the Australian Air Force, and they had a total of 19,000. So we didn't have to worry about sampling. We then got the data back, found a tremendous amount of variation between levels, job types, regions, length of service, all those different demographic factors were figured in. And we came back with a fairly extensive report and presented it to the Chief of the Air Force and to the Deputy Chief, who was really the champion of the whole idea of doing it. The results were used by a project team that they put together to look at and try to identify the key dilemmas that the Air Force was facing toward going toward the new era of a new improved Air Force. And they actually worked on these various dilemmas we had assessed and came up with new ways of looking at them, new ways of handling old problems. And what happened was, of course, we asked them to create new boxes rather than looking outside the box. And a new box to me is a cultural design for how you do things that you used to do differently. And in that cultural design, they were also asked to find ways to build on the strengths of the most opposite positions and to minimize the weaknesses of the most opposite positions and come up with a creative solution. So that's, in a nutshell, one particular project, but I've used it extensively for a number of years, but that was one way we went about it. But it's a little more labor intensive, and you gotta identify what's important to the people in the organization, their dilemmas and their particular social culture encounters that are important, and then you got to come up with a way of creating an assessment tool that you use, as opposed to
Jerry. I wonder, Jerry, if that's a resource that we could offer.
Let me just finish.
After.
One of the things that you don't want to do is to use the store-bought assessments unless you just want a quick and dirty solution. And so, anyway, Jeremy, what were you saying?
Hold on, restate that again. Don't want to use what assessments?
Store-bought assessments.
Oh, okay.
Things that were made somewhere and just simply layered over the organization. They may or may not have relevance to the people in the organization. And one of the reasons why I like the more labor-intensive approach is because we identify their key dilemmas and things that they're interested in, and then the whole assessment's based on that. And the result, so when they come back, becomes meaningful to them.
Well,
awesome stuff, Jerry. Sorry I cut you off there. Go ahead, Tom.
Being labor intensive means it's also expensive and makes it harder to sell when you're a consultant. So that's a dilemma.
Well, yeah, but just keep in mind, Tom, that there's a lot of people out there selling short-time solutions, and quite frankly, a lot of leaders might be aware of that, and some of them may not be. But the point of it is it is labor-intensive, but it yields results they want to know, and because it's based on what they want to hear, and it's based on their organization and their particular organizational culture elements, and that's what I found to be the value of it. And I've had to go back to 33 different executive committees, if you will, and present results back. And in every case, they were much more appreciative of it than had it been from some store-bought assessment tool that was just randomly given out. And not that those don't have some value sometimes, and they are quick and dirty. But I mean, the whole point of it is, do you want to do an assessment that leads to change and is part of change? Or do you want to just do an assessment and then somehow link it to the change? I guess that's what it comes down to, too.
Mm.
So, folks, I have been promising the groups that are smaller that we can get out 15 minutes early, which means we're coming to our last 10 minutes. We can always go to the full hour and a half if you'd like, and go till 30 after the hour, but it's now about 5 after the hour. What other burning comments or feedback or questions, topics do we want to dive into on today's conversation around culture and how it affects you in your work?
I'm still chewing on this relationship between organizational culture and organizational design. You know, from an organizational transformation perspective, which is where I live, it seems to me the implications of what Dr. Tom and others are saying is that, and this is not a core area of expertise for me, so I'll just throw that out right away, that when a client presents to us and they come with a problem, that it's very likely that their current design reflects a culture that's not working for them. Their current organizational design and our culture both are not working in some way. And then secondly, on a transfer model, that in order to create results for the client that really work for them, that both the culture and the organizational design have to be changed in a significant way that helps them get to a new and better place in their results and in their processes and psychology. So I'm thinking about organizational design in a different way now because of everything that's been said about culture. And I have a colleague who does a lot of organizational design work, and he's very socio-technical systems oriented. He focuses primarily on task, and he breaks what we would call culture. He breaks those elements down into very focused tasks and walks the client through change in that way. It's an incremental task by task process. From a transformational perspective, I start with culture because my work is all about positive, strengths-based, appreciative leadership and change. And I know that as long as they're stuck in the what's wrong with you model, they're not going to be able to create the results they want. But I haven't focused that much on organizational design as a kind of structural support, a chassis, if you will, for culture change. So definitely I'm going to be thinking a lot more about that. It's a very helpful discussion in that regard.
I think Jonathan wanted to say something.
Yeah, I just find myself thinking about a couple places where I've worked. I was working as a consultant with a large global company that was doing a cultural change. And they had a very nicely designed program, and it was rolled out at plants all over the United States and in other countries as well. I guess what was sort of difficult for me was that the program was very nice and very well designed, and it talked about the overlap and the intersection between individuals' values and the values of the organization. and how we needed to look for sort of that intersection in order for people to feel engaged and excited by the larger work that they were doing. I'm just struck by the fact that in a period of 2 or 3 months, I saw two things happen with that company. One of them was that they decided to, how shall I say this nicely, take away some of the pension benefits that had been promised and guaranteed to a large number of workers. And then within some months of that, they paid some very, very attractive, handsome bonuses to the top executives. So when you're trying to do this cultural rollout that's talking about teamwork and honesty and all this kind of stuff, I want to say that's not the only place that I've run into a huge gap between the, if you will, espoused theory and the theory in use. And I guess I have a lot of trouble how shall I say, being put in the position where it's so very clear that the people in the executive positions are trying to say the right things for instrumental reasons, but they're not behaving that way fundamentally. And I'd just be interested to hear whether other people have run into that problem in their practices. In another place I worked 1 year, I dug up some old Rensis Lickert book where there was a bunch of continuums about how you like to be managed. And at the low number, it was something like told what to do. And at the high number, it was something like lots of autonomy. But, you know, questions like that clearly had a directionality to them. And overwhelmingly, the people who were managers who I gave this to said, in answer to my first question, this is how I like to be managed. I like to be managed with autonomy. I like to be managed with, to be allowed to be creative. I like this, I like that. I want new job experiences. And then when you ask them how they managed their people, it's as if they were dealing with a different species, because they, to a person, would say, oh yes, but you can't manage your people that way, because they're just not mature enough, or they have a different value set, or they don't have enough education. There was always some reason why there was a gap between the way they would want to manage people and the way they would want to be managed. So how do you deal with gaps, either in values or in behavior, between the culture that you're trying to design and put into place and the one that's there in reality?
You know, I think that is, for me, Jonathan, and I'll step out of being a facilitator for 10 seconds to just offer a thought on this, because I've been noticing it in my own work. I think that there are lots of times where you have this, I know how I should be doing it, but the environment that I'm working in doesn't allow me to be able to do it how I should be doing it. That's one issue. And then the issue that you just described, I kind of see as different. That's where the person is saying, well, I want to be managed as if I'm a leader and an outstanding person and I can do my job effectively. But I don't think any of the people who work for me can do that. And it does create, you know, when I've had clients in that situation, my response to them has been kind of that same thing that, you know, people will say to a therapist, how can you ask me to come to you for therapy if you're not going to go for therapy yourself? Or how can you ask me to be an organization coach for you if you, you know, if I'm not actually getting an organization coach for myself? To me, it's very related to that. How can you expect your boss to treat you with autonomy and to trust you if you can't even trust your own people? And to me, that's part of that question. Aaron has had his hand raised, so I do want to give Aaron a chance to weigh in. and then we're going to take a couple more burning comments. So be thinking of those last burning comments that you've got, and we'll start wrapping up today's conversation. So Aaron, you want to weigh in for us? Okay, Aaron, you may still be on mute. Are you guys having trouble hearing me? Just kind of confirming.
No, I can hear you.
Okay, just double checking. So we're not, Aaron, Aaron, we are not hearing you if you're talking. I'll come back to you in just a moment because I am showing that you're unmuted. So we'll come back to you and try to get you to weigh in. Oh, I think we may have gotten you now. Aaron, go ahead.
Okay, I think, where the issue of, espouse or theory in use, I think, I've been a manager before, I've been a staff before. So if you are in a manager's position, the way you see things will be in a totally different perspective as people who are being managed. So we have to respect both cultures, which I do not want to say, which is better, because when you are in a union, people will be so different from the managers who are managing others. And the organization culture they want to create is so different, where one of the speakers talked about, the union have their own interests, in a way. And also, at the same time, when we are talking about, we want people to be like that, but we are not behaving like that, And also, it is also our issue of our own trust in other people. We want that, but we may not have the level of trust. So the way of building up the trust of the people, in a way, and the trust of and the culture there, where I also, to hear about, when we are talking about different types of cultures, I mentioned about the national ones, At the same time, where I work in organizations which are more sort of people-oriented. Some are more IT or systems oriented. They believe in the systems, Some are more sort of control oriented in a sense, In a way, how do we balance all this in order to create a culture that will be really, as a practitioner and OD, how do we really bring up the changes? One of the issues that people brought up, which will be of interest, is how do we measure culture, the different dimensions, Of course, we talk about focus groups, and I think it's important, the people side. And in order to understand culture, it can be very intensive. However, organizations that I have faced with many, where they do not really want to afford putting in so much in order to measure or to understand. But the people at the top level, we will just, feel about the culture, but not really, where managing, or measuring. Right now, where there are more surveys and which will be helpful, but the way of how do we measure culture and how then we use strategy and change strategy to match and bring the cultural change will be a huge dimension for us as OT professionals and practitioners to bring in. Thank you.
Right.
Awesome. Aaron, thank you so much. And I want to give others an opportunity to leave any final thoughts or reflections as you're leaving today's conversation. What is one thing that you're taking away or one insight that you're having or however you choose to check out? It's your checkout.
I want to respond to Jonathan because I think what he said is extremely important. It reminds me of the studies from the Center for Productivity and Quality back in the 90s, where they found they researched many large companies and divisions of large corporations, US, and to organizational change was the lack of match between what leaders say and what leaders do. That was the #1 impediment to change. Second of all, in my own experience, I work mostly with science, technology, engineering, and healthcare organizations, a rather highly educated group. And because of the model that I use, which is strengths-based, the leader's responsibility now becomes that of unearthing and unleashing the strengths of his or her team of direct reports, and so it waterfalls down. So being able to manage one way, but see your people as less, kind of fades away under the power of the strengths model. And also they are glued, most of my clients are glued together by the scientific method, which means they understand having a hypothesis, collecting data, trying something new, seeing how it works, kind of like the plan, do, check, act from quality. I've been done a lot of work in crisis healing and turnarounds in organizations. And I find that if the more the consultants in the what's wrong, the traditional OD what's wrong model, allow the negatives to predominate, the worse things get. But I come right in and put them into positive structures, even in terrible crises. And so the turnaround happens very quickly. I mean, they've already, you know, ventilated to everybody way before the consultant gets there. We already know we're not usually brought in early enough anyway. So that's just a practical reality. But but what I now have to think about, and my major takeaway from this conversation, and I thank everybody for all of your very thoughtful contributions. My head is just buzzing here. It's great. Is what is the relationship of organizational design and the strengths-based transformation and leadership work that I do? How can I incorporate organizational design as more of a variable to work with in projects? And I'm working on 4 leadership manuals for 4 of my engine and 4-wheel systems as we speak. So, you know, I need to, in my change manual, I'm working on the strengths manual right now, but the next one will be change in teams and meetings. And after that, crisis healing and turnaround, there's 4 altogether. And so, you know, I really need to factor in some comments about organizational design. And so I'll be working on that. And I thank all of you very much. Very, very helpful conversation.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lynn. I really appreciate that. Tom, Jonathan, any last thoughts or reflections from you? Then we'll come in to Jerry, and myself, and then we'll conclude today's call. So Tom or Jonathan, any last minute burning thoughts from you guys?
It's important to,
Thank you.
it's important to have alignment between the organization design and the culture. And I believe as a result of that, that you really can't change the culture unless you change the structure.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and it might be small ways, might be subtle, but if the structure doesn't change, then generally you have no way of enforcing a new culture.
Mm-hmm. That was huge for me. Thank you, Dr. Tom.
May I mention
Awesome.
structure as well as the systems and the processes and all those things that are part of an organization are really influenced by the culture. In other words, the structure an organization chooses is a result of the values and strategies someone in the organization has that has the power to set that up. One of the things that I just want to mention as a concluding comment is that I sit through meetings like this and discussions like this all the time, and particularly with OD people and org change people, and I'm amazed at how seldom you hear anyone refer to the use of power. And power is probably one of the most important elements in any kind of change and development process. And I'm going to say something else that will cause you all to get angry with me, but at least I know I can turn off my TV in a few minutes here. The proper manipulation of power is absolutely critical to a change agent and an OD person, whether you like it or not. So if you work with the people who have the power and you want to somehow influence them to put in a particular system, or you want them to put in the system they choose to have, or they're looking at some idealistic change, power has to be part of it. How you use that power and how you go about manipulating the power structure is up to you. But I certainly have hundreds of experiences in organizational change cases I've been in where that was not a recognized variable, and yet it became, in the long run, something that you created or didn't create the change that was desired. And finally, the desired change is something else I have trouble with. I think that so many change designs and change models are just simply based on someone's values. And if that's the case, then the person who is a change agent needs to realize that they're asking people who may behave differently to behave like them. And I think there are ethical concerns there, if particularly if the people who in that organization don't want to be changed or who have different values from the change agent. I think that's often overlooked in their need to. That's all I'm going to say.
All really great feedback. I'm going to ask Jerry J. John if you have anything to add. Go ahead and jump right in here. If not, I'm going to go ahead and start wrapping us up.
Nothing to add here.
Okay. I think, you know, I honestly believe that one of the power pieces of the ISODC Roundtable is that we're able to really collaboratively discuss a lot of different topics that address challenges, that increase our effectiveness, that also help us make ourselves more successful in our work. And I think sometimes as consultants, there's a natural tendency to try to gain, you know, a consensus in a conversation. And I think sometimes we need to be comfortable with the idea that there are different perspectives and different ideas that are being brought to the table. And I say that because culture, especially when we were looking at how to frame this conversation, you know, culture is a very huge topic in itself. And so really hoping that each of you have been able to walk out of this conversation with some insight on how culture impacts your work and how you're able to use some of the ideas or some of the discussion that we've had today to advance your work and increase your effectiveness in your endeavors. I want to take just a moment to thank Jerry Glover for helping us by being quote unquote the expert on culture in the room, if you will, although I think one of the things that we found from today's conversation is that each of us bring wisdom and perspective to really help inform that conversation. We will follow up by early next week with a recap of the call and a recording that you'll be able to listen to. I also want to encourage each of you to complete the poll that's on your screen. It should be popping up shortly, and it gives you the opportunity to weigh in on a couple questions to evaluate today's call, but we will send a more extensive evaluation when we do the recap. I also want to thank ISODC for hosting these roundtables. ISODC.org is where you can find information about the organization, including upcoming conferences. The webinar that we are going to be doing with Bjorn, oh my goodness, Jerry, maybe you can help me. I'm totally blanking on his last name, Jurgenov, I believe, or something like that. But he's got a book that he has recently released, and we're going to be doing a fireside chat on that on November 2nd. And as always, mark your calendars for the ISODC Roundtable, which happens every even month, the first Tuesday at either 9 a.m. or 4 p.m. If you've got ideas or topics that you think we should use to help guide our ISODC Roundtable discussions, please feel free to send those in. I also want to just say thank you to, this is a little bit of a weird thing to say, but thank you to my staff at S&G Endeavors. We really do run the logistics and design for the roundtables, and just really appreciate John Spalding and Jerry J. John, who are working for our team. And it's always great working with Roland and everybody, and Jerry Glover as well, to make sure that these conversations are successful. Also, a big thanks to promotional sponsors Nexus for Change and Center for Appreciative Inquiry. Again, our next roundtable will be the first Tuesday of December at either 9 a.m. or 4 p.m. Please mark your calendars and look for more promotion by the end of the month. And if you have any questions, please feel free to stick around. I really appreciate everybody taking time to complete the poll that was on your screen, and we will resume these conversations the first Tuesday in September. So thank you all very much, and this concludes today's call.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Great work.
Thanks, everybody. All right. Anybody need anything else from me?